The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute is charged with the idea of taking the lessons from the past and transferring them to our future.
As stewards of history in the Birmingham movement, the BCRI houses incredible collections that show and document where the community has come from and how the Birmingham movement both came to be and was so successful.
For more than 25 years, the Institute has educated people about what happened here in the 60s, not just in Birmingham, but across our country. Civil rights and equality challenged today just as they were many decades ago. We are here to enlighten each generation about civil and human rights by exploring our common past and working together in the present to build a better future.
Through many educational offerings, we teach the idea that the changes in Birmingham, Alabama were not just because of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Reverend Ralph Abernathy. A lot of these changes took place because of the youth in this city. And due to that, we have a mission to share with the youth of today what youth in their generations in the past have done. Through our Legacy Youth Leadership Program, we bring high school students from all over the Jefferson County area here to study this narrative and to serve as docents and ambassadors to the Civil Rights Institute. We have BCAP, which is the Birmingham Cultural Alliance Project, where we visit middle school students and we take them through this history and through this narrative so that they can prepare to understand their role in society. We have outreach programs that visit many schools and institutions to highlight the story of accomplishment, the story of overcoming, the story of a power and the movement that people in Birmingham were able to bring to bear to change not only the city, but the state, the nation, and the world.
By making it accessible to researchers and local students from middle, high, and university students, they're able to come in and see where we've been so that they can go and be better stewards of Birmingham and our present and then our future.
Thank you for joining us for this engaging virtual conversation series. We invite you to help us continue the work for civil rights through racial justice by becoming a member or donating to our work. You can find us on our social media platforms to stay connected with us. Thanks again for your support.
Greetings. Welcome to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute virtual program series, Historically Speaking. My name is Charles Woods, and I'm the Education Programs Manager as well as the Outreach Coordinator for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And I want to welcome you to our virtual conversation series called Historically Speaking. Today we are focusing on, historically speaking, who am I? Genealogy basics and best practices. And always here at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, we want to foster dialogue and conversation about difficult issues and topics and provide a space to have these discussions. Thank you for joining us today. And now we're going to go ahead and get started. Today, I have a young man by the name of John Lanier. Mr. Lanier, can you introduce yourself for us, please?
Sure. I'm John Lanier. I'm a member of the Birmingham African American Genealogy Group here in Birmingham, Alabama. And I count it a very high honor and pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to be talking about some of the essentials of genealogy, where I emphasize genealogy basics pertaining particularly to African American genealogical research.
And we thank you for that today. And this is an important topic because as African Americans, even the phrase African American, we use that term because most of the Black people here in the United States do not know the exact tribe or country where their ancestors arrived from on these shores from Africa. And so this is an important conversation because it allows you to not only learn more about yourself, but also attach a geographical location or a particular tribe to our lives today, and it allows us to have increased identity as a Black person in this country. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. Hopefully at the end we'll have some time for individuals to send in their questions and we can answer some questions. Always put your questions in the chat, Facebook or YouTube, and we'll try to address those. So we can go ahead and get started. Mr. Lanier.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. Woods. It's a pleasure, as I said, to be here. Um, my slide says I'm with the Birmingham African American Genealogy Group. This is a very important topic, and I, especially as I speak to the younger crowd, the younger generation, those who are actually elementary school right up through college. It's very important because at some point in time, people want to know, who am I? Where did I come from? Who are my folks? That kind of thing. And what I want to do today is share with you some ideas on how to get back to knowing where you come from. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Here you see the outline. The outline today says that it first of all introduces the purpose of our presentation, but also I will say a few our organization, parent organization, provide you with some basic tools with your genealogy or help you progress even further than where you are now. Basically, our goal within our organization is for every member of our group to get back to 1870. And I'll explain the importance of 1870 to you, particularly if you have roots in Alabama. Now, this presentation is not just about Alabama, but specifically if you have roots in Alabama. There's some additional information that we will have available to you. Next slide, please. First of all, a little bit about ourselves, about the Birmingham African American Genealogy Group. It was founded in 1999 in Birmingham, Alabama by two aspiring young ladies, Miss Josephine Martin and Mary Jones Fitz, to fill an unmet need. They wanted to know more about their ancestry. While we have the Birmingham Genealogical Society, rather, they were not paying specific attention to the needs of what we saw as the African American genealogy research approach. They were very helpful in helping to get us organized in the early years, and we have since now moved on to the become an incorporated organization as well as a nonprofit 501c3 organization. I apologize for the phone ringing in the background. In under the leadership of Ms. Wanda Looney, we became a 501c3 organization in 2013, and we're still active in that way. Next slide, please. Talks about our mission. This mission is very critical and to us. Is to promote awareness of our American heritage with the special emphasis on African American history, heritage rather, and culture through the education and scholarship, particularly of our middle and high school grades. And we usually meet the second Sunday monthly, with the exception of the month of February, where we do a Black History Fair, which we just completed this month. And also we meet on the third Sunday in May, because the second Sunday is Mother's Day, and we definitely honor Mother's Day. If you need to get more information about our group, we ask that you will log on to the www.baagginc.org for more information about us. Next slide, please. Well, let's look at researching your family. What does that entail? This is the heart of why we are here today. We want all to learn more about their ancestors. Who were they? Who are they? Who am I in the context of my ancestry? Where were they born? When did they come here and why? What did they do? Et cetera, et cetera. Those are lots of questions we have about our ancestors. Let me just say this: African American research, rather, can be very difficult and outright discouraging. However, but it can also be rewarding when you find a lost or connect with a lost ancestor. Some, let's be honest about it, some of our ancestors will never be found, but don't stop looking. You may be the first in your family to start piecing together this puzzle, as we call it, and some family members will not appreciate your work even. Others will deny for whatever reason, but the results of your work. But the bottom line is, in all of this, there are no perfect families, but we have a responsibility to ourselves and to our heirs, as well as to the ancestors, that our young people coming along will know where they come from. Because every young person, every person in this world has some lineage, and they need to understand that lineage to better understand themselves and where they're going. Next slide, please. Well, let's look at researching your family further. Where do I start? Well, one way to get started is to start with yourself first. Okay. In other words, you know, when you were born, you know your parents generally, you know where you live, you know what city, county, state you were born in. So you start there. But then you also start to collect what we call the oral histories, or information about your family. And typically you start with the oldest person in your family that's closest to you. Could be a parent, could be a grandparent, could be a great grandparent in some cases. These people are walking around with a wealth of knowledge, and sometimes they don't talk about it. But sometimes when you ask them in the right way, they may want to share something with you about their ancestry, about their history. So you start collecting these stories. One way to do it now, since almost everyone has a smartphone, is ask them, grandmother or aunt so-and-so, do you mind if I record our conversation? Don't pressure them. And the recording is almost transparent. I mean, they don't know oftentimes that they're being recorded. So you want to have a casual conversation with them, and you're asking them questions that you want answered. First of all, where did you come from? When were you born? Um, were you in the military? Um, where were your family? Where's your family from? So you want to go back as far as you can, and don't judge what they're saying. Don't judge the language or the dialect or whatever they're using, but just capture the information as it's purely given to you. Now, you'll also want to know about, um, as I said, whether they were military, whether they were, whether they migrated here from someplace else. I mean, after emancipation, that's important. And don't overlook um, information that may be in attics or shoe boxes or old files that's stored at someone's home. There may be a wealth of information about your family's history. It may contain, in addition to military records, it may contain birth records, death records, especially since 1908 in Alabama. Some of these documents are hidden away, and you may look at them collectively as junk or trash, but go through them first before you discard them, because more than likely you're going to find a lot of information there. Could be employment records that you will need later on. There's a gold mine of information out there waiting to be discovered. You may find some old photos, even wills, insurance documents. So, and then also don't rely totally on one's memory, because one's memory will fade. And so we have to use all of this information that's available to us to help put together our picture here, the family picture. Let's move on to our next slide. I'd like to share with you a couple of tools that I use and that our organization uses to, excuse me, to try and document your lineage. Now, we're talking about genealogy here. And when we talk about genealogy, we're trying to determine um, your blood relatives, if you will, okay, as opposed to family history. Family history, we're looking at family relationships. But when we look at genealogy, we're looking at blood relatives. In other words, who is my biological father? Who is my biological mother? Some of that is known, some of it will never be known. But that's what we're trying to start with. So I've given you a couple of documents. Hopefully you can see them okay. The document on the left side here, I'm going to point to that, is what we call a pedigree chart. Sometimes it's called an ancestral chart. The chart will be numbered from 1 to on up to 64. This, by the way, is a 6th-generation chart itself. Starting with yourself, when you want to document your findings, you start with yourself. And what you want to do with yourself is you want to enter your name. Now, if you're a married female, enter your maiden name. As a matter of fact, wherever you enter a female's name and she's married, make sure you enter her given name, her maiden name, if you will, because oftentimes the married name gets lost in the sauce, so to speak. It gets lost over time. And a lot of times you will lose a whole surname stream of family that you can't relate to because you don't know the surname, the original maiden name of that relative. So you want to start with yourself, and on this chart here, on the number 1, if you can read that, it will ask for the name of the person, the birth date. Okay. And a lot of times, I'm not sure if you're familiar with military dates, you will say something like, if you were born August 9th, 1950, you might say 9 August, 9 AUG, 1950. And that way, it cuts down on a lot of confusion later on. And then when you use the county or the state, you will say, for example, city of Birmingham, comma, Jefferson, which is the county, comma, Alabama. So that's how you enter that information, typically when you're trying to enter a location. Also, it will ask you for the place of maybe a marriage, and normally that marriage record will come under the male's name. For example, number 2 is the father up here, the mother is down here. So it'll ask for, if they're married, it'll ask, okay, well, who is your father? You know, his date of birth, where was he born, and then they want to know the marriage date if you know that. And then if they passed on, they'll ask for death information like the death date, location. So all of that information is important. But the idea is to go from yourself all the way back to 1870. All the way back to 1870. Now, let's not kid ourselves. That's a lot of work. And there is going to be a lot of holes, but you enter as much information as you can justify and trying to get back to 1870. Okay, and why 1870? 1870 is important because it was the first U.S. census that was taken that now includes previously enslaved people. Those individuals who were enslaved prior to 1870, up until 1865, were slaves. We were not even considered citizens of the United States, didn't have the right to vote. So after emancipation, a lot of that changed. After the 13th Amendment, we became citizens of the United States. Okay. Well, first of all, after 1865, slavery was abolished. Then we became citizens, and then the males became legally eligible to vote. Okay, so that's the importance of that date. So by 1867, we could legally claim our U.S. citizenship because we were citizens after 1865. And so in Alabama, we also had in 1866 an Alabama state census. So that census is important for those counties who conducted it. I don't have the list of counties in front of me right now, but I guarantee if you check with the Birmingham Public Library, they can tell you all of those counties within Alabama that conducted the 1866 census. And that's important because it was only 1 year after emancipation. And many of our folk had not moved or relocated or changed their names, that kind of thing. So you're going to get a fairly pure sense of where people were in 1866, particularly living in Alabama counties. So let's move on to the next slide. I'm going to show you a companion chart. The companion record or chart is what we call a family group record. The family group record, if you will notice, it contains some of the same information that you will find on the pedigree chart, except that it's a little more extensive. It may include the occupation of the person that you're recording here. And for both the husband, like in this case, John L. Lanier, in addition to his date of birth, date of death, where he was born, it also includes that he was a school teacher and a musician. It also included his father's name, his mother's name, which we will see in the next generation on the pedigree chart, but it's all right here. And it says when they married, my mom, this is my mother, Mary Queen Robinson, same thing. She was born in Lowndes County, Mississippi, near Columbus. She was a bookkeeper. Her father was Calvin Robinson. Her mom was really, that should be Lily Mae Williams Robinson. That's an error. There should be Lily Mae Williams. And then, of course, myself. And you can put all of this on one form on the backs and in my wife's name. And it also lists where on these numbers, it expands some information that you can enter down here. It says where my dad was baptized, where my mom and dad were married, what church they were married, and so forth. So This unit, this is called a family group sheet. It's really important because it's a companion to the pedigree chart. And if you're trying to set up a filing system, you want to have your pedigree chart, this particular chart, this particular record, because it captures what we call the nuclear family. That is the father and mother and the children, if there were any, living in the same as a family. And you'll have one of these for every grouping of nuclear families from where you are now all the way back to 1870. Now, you're going to have 48 or more sets of these records if you were to be diligent and you're able to capture this information. So you want to keep these filed together. You want to keep your pedigree chart. You want to keep your family group records together. And also, we'll talk a little bit later about the your research log, because your research log is important. It helps you keep track of places that you've searched or researched to gather this information. Okay. Also on here, I just mentioned one of those things. Sometimes a spouse may be married more than once. And so there's a place on this record where you can enter another spouse. Say your grandmother may have been married a second time because the first husband passed away, that kind of thing. And it kind of helps you keep track of who is in that nuclear family. Next slide, please. We look at other information that's available to us, such as family pictures. Just about every African American home has some pictures somewhere around, either they're on the walls or they're stored someplace. And here, these pictures help to tell your story. These two photos here are my great grandfather and my great grandmother, my mom's brother. And the reason I know this is because their names are on the back of the pictures. Okay. This is a family photo of one of our family reunions back in the late 70s. And then you have some obituaries. All of this information helps to tell the story. I'll move on to the next slide, and that you'll see more pictures and programs and obituaries. This is an obituary of my mom. It contains information about her life and where she was funeralized. Her brother, who was her oldest brother, who died a year after she did. He was also a pastor of a church. So there's information about his life there. And this is my mom's mother. She passed away in the 50s. But this information adds life to your ancestral tree that you're building. So you don't want, and then also I tell a lot of African American African Americans in my audience, don't overlook newspapers, especially African American newspapers, because the African American newspapers will carry information that you would not see in the white press or in white newspapers. And a lot of this would be in quite detail. For example, Chicago Defender had active reporters in Birmingham during the civil rights movement. And then when we had this period of lynchings, they were constantly writing about lynchings in Alabama and in the South. There were other newspapers also available. The African American newspaper out of Baltimore and Washington had active reporters here. So just because your family may not have shown up in a local newspaper doesn't not necessarily mean they were not captured in a newspaper. So oftentimes we overlook that. Our next slide. I'm going to run through quickly some other tools that you have available. One is what we call the Birmingham City Directory. You find this at the Birmingham Public Library, and the reason I was using this resources because I was trying to locate about the time my mom and her family came to Birmingham, Alabama from Autauga County. And this directory gives me the first year that they showed up here in Birmingham. And at that address, this is alphabetically. It shows my mom's, my second oldest brother, my second oldest uncle rather, on my grandmother's side, the oldest brother, and then down further you'll see some other names like my grandmother who was living, and then it also told me the exact address, and it gave me the occupation. So you see Lily Mae Williams. Well, she was a maid. And it also told me the street that they were living on. Okay, they lived on Sattler, where there's no longer a Sattler Avenue. It's now called Powell Avenue over in Titusville. So it told me when they first came to Birmingham, and it gave me a place to look in Birmingham. So naturally from there, I know about what schools my mom may have attended, what high school she attended, that kind of thing. And I know my mom came here about 1937, 1938, because that directory is published about a year after a person arrives here. So that information is on display at the Birmingham Public Library, and in some cities it may be online. So that's a valuable tool for you to use to try and place where your ancestors may have lived in a city, particularly a larger city. Next slide, please. Here I've got for you a death certificate. Death certificates can be very good. They can also disappoint you at times, but a death certificate is very valuable because it'll give you the county where a person passed away. This says Otaugaville, but the county should be Autauga County. And the city in this case is Prattville. It gives you the name of the deceased, in this case, Calvin Robinson, male, colored, okay? His wife was Lily Robinson. He was about 50 years of age. But more importantly, as we scroll down the page, what I didn't know until I read this document, I always thought they were from Prattville because that's all I knew. Well, guess what? They were born in Lowndes County, Alabama. Both Mose Robinson, who was his father, and Winnie Robinson, who was his mother, they were both born in Lowndes County. Now, I know that in my later research, the Robinson family, the slave owners, had 5 plantations in 3 different counties along the Alabama River. They were Lowndes County, Autauga County, and in Montgomery County, Alabama. So, and I suspect he probably moved these slaves back and forth. And I was looking for my grandmother's, my great grandmother's maiden name, and it dawned on me, everybody on those plantations probably had a last name of Robinson, even though they may have had different lineages. Okay, so this is a very important document. The other good thing is that these these death records and birth records started to be standardized and mandated in 1908 by the state of Alabama. Now, in some cases, you may find for a birth record, you may find in a county maybe like Autauga County, you may find in their records some midwife records of births, but it became mandatory in 1908 that all births and all deaths be recorded. Okay. Move on to the next slide. The other tools I would like to share with you is what we call the census records. Most people will look for the U.S. Census record first in their research. I would say learn a little bit about the history first before you go delving into this, but if you must, the census record is recorded by county, by state and by county. This is a record from part of a record from 1900, and it shows information about my maternal grandmother. Her name was Lily Mae Williams Robinson, and it shows where she was at the time in 1900. She was living with her mother. She was the eldest of several siblings, and what I found strange is that her husband was not there. His name was John Robinson, John Williams, rather, John Williams, and he was not there. I found out later that he was working in Pratt City in the Birmingham area as a coal miner. Uh, I don't know why his name was not showing up here as the head of the household, but at this time, his wife was considered the head of the household. So this is a snapshot of where my grandmother and my great grandparents were living on my mom's side in 1900. Let's move to the next slide. And you see 20 years later, this is 1920, and the county is Lowndes County in Mississippi. Okay. Um, my mother's mother had married. She married a gentleman, Calvin Robinson. They were sharecroppers, um, living in just outside of Columbus, Mississippi, over in Lowndes County. And it shows everyone who was living in the household at the time. Now, it took me a while to find this because when the record was indexed, the person had misspelled the last and first name of my grandfather, and that's why I could never find it until years later. But the bottom line is, it told me um, a lot about them, and it also shed some light on the record on my grandmother, even though she was born in Alabama, but her father was born in North Carolina. And the question you asked then was, when did he come to Alabama? I mean, did he come from North Carolina as a slave, or was he sold to Alabama, somebody in Alabama? Well, as it turned out, right after emancipation, he decided he was going to look for his relatives, and he walked from Raleigh, North Carolina to Alabama to try and find relatives. We're not sure who he was looking for. I know he ended up in Marengo County, probably near the Fonsdale Plantation. That's where a lot of slaves ended up in Marengo County. So that's another tool that you can use that will help you in a lot of ways to determine at least the state where many of your ancestors may have been born or raised in. Okay. Now, let me just make one other note here. My great grandfather, I had looked for him in Alabama, the one that was born in North Carolina, in the 1870 census. I could never find him. This explains why I could never find him, because he was born in North Carolina. Quite frankly, I couldn't find him in the North Carolina census either. So he may have been, as soon as emancipation hit, he was somewhere between North Carolina and Alabama. So I'll have to check those other states to see, if I can find them there. More than likely, I'll find them. Okay, let's now look at how do we get back to 1870 in a little more detail. We talked about objectives, at least for our BAG members, and typically for African Americans. When you're doing your research, your goal is to get back to 1870. Why 1870? Again, it was the first U.S. census that counted previously enslaved people. Okay, previously enslaved people. Everybody by 1870 who had been previously enslaved was in the 1870 census. So by 1870, we were free. We were U.S. citizens. African American males were given the right to vote, as I stated earlier, if they were 21 years of age or older. And they started to register. The first main registration period was in 1867. So in Alabama, if you go back to the county records, more than likely, and if you know who that ancestor is, you're probably going to find a voting record of that person. And the other good thing is you're going to find them living in clusters. Like I found my great great grandfather and all of his brothers all living right there together. I mean, they all registered within days of each other at the Prattville courthouse there in Watauga County, and lo and behold, they're all right there. So that's a find that I didn't think I was ever going to make. Alabama, uh, just to remind you, Alabama did also conduct a 1866 census in most counties. And the last sub-bullet there, let's see, says studying U.S. history, African American, local and military history helps to place your family and your genealogy into perspective. So um, we always say we're going to go ahead and do the genealogy, but you got to have some idea of what it is you're looking for. So the historical aspect is critical. Sometimes you may have to go in and study the history of a county, like the history of Autauga County and history of Jefferson County. You know that Birmingham wasn't formed until 1871. So you may be looking, well, why wasn't Birmingham more visible during the Civil War? Well, Birmingham didn't exist until after the Civil War. So you won't find much written. You may find some communities like over in Arlington and some other places like maybe like Woodlawn mentioned, but they were not part of the incorporated city as we have today, Birmingham, Alabama. Let's move on and do a little more digging into how do we get back to 1870. Once we have identified our ancestral home, that's the key. Where is your ancestral home in Alabama, particularly, or wherever? We must now determine who the slave owners were. Okay. Just because my last name is Lanier does not necessarily mean that the last slave owner was last name was Lanier. In this case, one of the last slave owners was a Lanier in Autauga County. But we must research the slave owner and his genealogy. You will search the 1870 records. Now, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because it can be very technical, but you're going to look at the 1870 census. You're going to look at where your people were staying. More than likely, they were staying on land owned by the slave owner. Okay. So when you look at those, if you look at the 1870 census, you're going to look at your relatives, and you may have to go back a page, go forward a page to find out who that landowner was. And the way you'll know that is because the value of his property was so high. He probably owned several hundred acres, plus a lot of livestock, and some of that was captured in the value of his property. And then you're going to find, let's say you think your second great grandparent was born, let's say you think she was born around 1848 for example. So that means in 1870 rather, okay, you go from 1848 to 1870. Okay, she's about 22, is that right? Roughly 22. And you're going to look in the 1860 and the 1850 slave schedule. Now, 1850, she would not have been born. I'm sorry, 1850, she would have been born because she would have been about 2 years of age on the slave schedule. And remember, the slave schedule only covers the owner's name, the slave owner's name, and it lists the slaves who were on his plantation in 1850 and 1860. But they're only listed by age and by sex. So if your second great grandparent was born in 1848, they would have been 2 years roughly in 1850. But look for 5 years. Look for somebody who was between the ages of 2 and say maybe 7. Okay. And it's then a search. It's an inferred search. And hopefully you will find children or even adults who were in that range. And then once you do that, the next thing you want to do, if at all practical or possible, is look for a will that person had. If he passed away before 1865, there was probably a will, and that will was probated, which meant that it had to account for all of his property. Okay, both livestock, stuff he had in his home, slaves who were considered chattel, they were property. And it will list each individual by name. I guarantee you, in more cases than not, you're going to run across somebody who probably fits the description of that ancestor that you're looking for. Now, it takes time and patience to do that. Okay, so we have the 1870 census. Again, we also have the 1866 census, which may be even may be helpful if it was done in that county. And then we have to take that information and compare it to what you find in the 1850 and the 1860 census. And more than likely, you're going to find the plantation that your family worked on, and you're going to probably find some relatives that you never knew you had. Those county probate and land records are critical to your search. And you may end up having to trace your ancestors back to, say, Virginia or North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, because a lot of times these large landowners, somebody who may have had 90 or 100 slaves, probably had another plantation back in his home state. But when Alabama opened up, guess what he did? He sought after additional land. Some of these were just middle-class people who saw an opportunity to get rich, which they did. And so they came to Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and established plantations. But you may have to go back and look in other places to see where they originated from. That's part of your research. Okay, continuing, going to the next slide, number 17. Yeah. The probate records may show his property, including the slaves, which were property, was settled after the slave owner's death. And this is what I'm talking about before 1865. Even after 1865, you may be lucky enough to find some additional information, but it may be more difficult. You may have to go into land records, that kind of thing. Now, one other source I didn't mention in my references on this in this presentation is US GenWeb. US GenWeb. It's a volunteer organization that's set up in counties, just about in every state. And what they do is they go in and they will digitize records, land records, wills, cemetery records. A lot of times you will find some information in that free database about your relatives. I found a few for mine in Ottawa County. So that's another source of information for you. Moving on to some other areas we have to consider. We all ultimately are trying to locate our African or other ancestral lands. We're trying to get back home, basically. How do we get back to where we come from? And that also answers the question, who am I and where did I originate from? Most African Americans came from sub-Saharan Africa aboard slave vessels to the United States via the Caribbean, in some cases, via Cuba. Even a few of us came through Brazil. Some came through Haiti early on, very early on. But today we have exhausted the paper trail. And so what is there left to do? What other tools are there available to us? Well, one is DNA testing. Several of our people I know have done the DNA testing to see if they can try to find that missing link in their past. I would just say this very quickly about DNA testing. You should have a paper trail that is a companion piece to your DNA test, because the genetic test by itself is not enough information to determine where you think your people came from. Okay, because you're going to get bombarded with people who thinks they are your third or fourth cousin, and you won't be able to verify that unless you have some sort of a paper trail. And I would caution everybody, when you get that, when you do the DNA test, you're excited, you know where your, you know, what your genetic makeup is and what area of the world um, your ancestors came from. But before you share your information with anybody, ask them the simple question: who do you believe our common ancestor is? Who is our common ancestor? And can you share that information with me rather than just freely giving out your information? Because some people will take your information and without any analysis will populate a tree, and it will just confuse everybody. So I ask you to take a look at that before you share your DNA information. Make sure you know who you're sharing it with and that you all have some common ancestor that you can verify. Okay. Our let's see, our next slide is yeah, just quickly, not everybody in your family may have come in through the traditional route of the via the Caribbean. You will find out that some of your people were here before the country was established. Remember, we go back to 1619 or even 1500s in some cases. So if they were under the crown, the English crown, and during the Revolutionary War, they decided to fight for the crown or to support the crown, well, guess what happened at the end of the American Revolution War, Revolutionary War? They ended up heading to Canada because that's what they did, and a lot of them ended up in Nova Scotia and other places. Um, we also have slaves that fled to Canada after the passage of the Slave Fugitive Act, because states had to give up slaves. They went north and they were in New York, and that slave was found in that state. They had to give up the slaves. So rather than stopping in New York or Vermont, they kept going into Canada because they had a little protection there. After emancipation, we find out that lots of our families from the deep south headed west and north because they didn't know what was going to happen after emancipation. They didn't know if it was going to be reinstalled or just what. So they headed west. Some went way out to Vancouver, and several of them, and they left in groups from places like Dallas County. They went into Canada, and they're still there. So, and then we have other cases where we traded with Caribbean nations, and at times after 1865, some of the sailors or the laborers on those vessels decided they want to stay in the United States. In Maryland, there are several instances or examples where um, the gentleman makes this trip from Barbados to the United States and decides, "Hey, I'm going to apply for citizenship." And guess what? He he was granted citizenship. So you're going to have to be open-minded and determine where your folk really came from. Let me just and then also studying the Underground Railroad is important too. I'm going to move quickly through the next slides. These are just resources and tools that you will find helpful. I look at Stephen Morse, the first name there. What his site will be important, particularly when the 1950 census is released next year in April, on April 1st, because we'll more than likely not be indexed. And so he has a way of getting you to your enumeration district, basically. That one, and then there's some other tools that I've listed here, some other software. I would say before you invest a lot of money in software, give it a try. Talk to folk who may be using it before you invest your hard-earned money into that. Next slide. Critical, document your site, your sources. The reason why you want to do that, because you want to eliminate anxiety, confusion, um, and misunderstandings. And literally, you want to leave a paper trail for someone who's coming after you, um, so that your findings will be repeatable to them. Because we know that websites change, and you want to at least document where you found certain information. And to do that, you need to have a log. I talk about a research log, where you also keep track of your pedigree charts and your family group sheets. That's important. And you want to file them under the surname. In other words, if I'm searching for Lanier or Robinson or Williams, you want to have that information filed that way under the surnames, which is important. Next slide. In conclusion, study the history before searching your ancestors. That's really important, especially the county history and the state history. That will give you some idea of when the state was opened up, particularly a place like the Mississippi Territory, which ended up having Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia carved out. I'm sorry, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas carved out of it, which will give you a sense of when folk may have come into the state. Also, remember you're assembling pieces of a puzzle, uh, and you're leaving a gift for your heirs, which is important. They must learn and know that they have a history, but it may well start with you. And so you got to document your findings, and then you want to share this at some point with your family. The next slide, if I may, is some selected references that hopefully you'll find helpful. Birmingham is fortunate enough to have some very valuable resources for genealogy. As a matter of fact, our library is one of the top 10 in the country for Southern history. And then there are some free tools out there on family search. There's the premium sites like Ancestry, but I believe some of that now is being made available free to you through the Birmingham Public Library. And then, of course, National Archives is the place to go if you're trying to find government records such as military pensions. If you had relatives who served in the U.S. colored troops right after the Civil War, a lot of their records would be at the National Archives and online and available to you. I think I've just about exhausted my time, and I want to leave a couple of minutes for Q&A.
Oh yes, I just want to say, wealth of information, very informative presentation, and we thank you all. Thank you for that. But we did have a couple questions that came in.
Okay.
One of the quick questions, and I think it's probably be a quick answer, was, have you ever come across information that had slave owners, so people who own slaves but not working their own land? So you got a slave owner, he owns slaves, but he's basically working another slave, another owner's
Yeah.
land.
Yeah. Yes. That was a common practice on some plantations. The slave owner will hire out his slaves,
Mm,
particularly if they were skilled.
mm,
Carpenter, metal workers, blacksmiths. And the way it worked is that once they hired them out, they got part of their pay.
mm,
However, it was an opportunity for a slave to keep some of his money. And the first thing they did was they invested it in land, purchased land. So if you look at some of these records right at emancipation, you'll find out that several slaves had hundreds of acres of land because they were able to turn that money into land
right.
wealth. Yeah. So yeah,
Let me
that was a fairly common practice.
let me ask you this: how difficult do you think it will be to do what Alex Haley did with tracing his genealogy back, without using DNA?
I think it would be very difficult. And fortunately, Alex Haley, if you read his bio, he had done a lot of because he was in the Coast Guard, I believe,
Mm,
and he was able to sail to a lot of local ports. And he was smart enough to realize, hey man, my family probably came from Africa, or they did come from Africa, because he heard a lot of stories from
Mhm.
his ancestors, from his grandparents, his great grandparents, and they told him basically the plantation that they worked on and whereabout in Africa. Told him what river to look for, the Gambia River,
Mhm.
and that helped him immensely. But you got to have those kinds of details
Right.
to get you back there. Now, I know a family in Maryland, a friend of mine's family, and he showed me that family tree back in the early 1970s. That tree must have had close to, I don't know, 600-700 people on it.
Wow.
Because, but what they did is they celebrated their history. And what was so cool about it, it had people, they could go back to 1600 in Maryland, where their family lived and worked the land. And not only that, he showed me the black sheep of the family. You know, they were included in the family, but they were black sheep. They could take a picture at the reunions. Other than that, stay away. You know what I mean? But they recognize them as their family.
Right. And I'm sure those families had a very strong oral history tradition within their own families
Absolutely.
that
They
help
did.
make those things possible.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's really important, because sometimes we are ashamed of some of the folk in our family. We're ashamed of some of the things that may have happened. But like I said, there are no perfect families. We have to get over the stigma of the things that have gone bad. I mean, there's all kinds of anything you can name. There's rape, there's incest, all kinds of things. But you got to document your family, and you
Mhm.
got to get past these things, because you can't change history. You just got to document it and look and learn from it.
Last question, and then we'll get out of here.
Yes, sir.
How important do you think this work is that we're doing right now, learning your own genealogy, historical and DNA,
Hmm.
in the fight for reparations that's going on in the country today? Do you think that if reparations, or that idea of reparations coming down to African Americans who were descendants of enslaved Africans in this country, you're going to have to prove, who you are and where you come from? And so, do you think that this same kind of conversation will be important in that fight?
I think so. If it happens, um, there's so many ways that you can show that you're eligible for some sort of compensation. I don't know what the answer can be, because I've heard all kinds of possibilities, but certainly proving that you were here, particularly before 1865, I think is critical.
Mhm.
And having that family history, and believe it or not, there are lots of slave owners, former slave owners, and families of slave owners who have archives and archives of information that may have to be opened up if this were to happen, to show that who these slaves were, and then at some point you're going to have to show how you connected to that particular family.
Mhm.
So I think all of this is important.
Well, I thank you again for coming with us today. I thank everyone for celebrating Black History Month with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Please go to our website, www.bcri.org, for the rest of our calendar for Black History Month. On February the 25th at 12 p.m., we have Redefining the Black Image, Fictional Black Families. That'll be our last panel discussion for Black History Month. I also implore individuals who have high school age children, please go to our website if they're interested in history, Black history, learning about the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and our galleries. Please go to our website and sign up for our Legacy Youth Leadership Program. That is a program for docents and leaders that we train to become docents of our galleries, but also give them an intense African American and American history lesson, and just a leadership program that is just phenomenal. That's all. I could say more, but it's just a great program. And please, if you all are interested, go to our website and fill out those applications. And once again, Mr. John Lanier, thank you again. Birmingham African American Genealogy Group. Check out their website. Log on to their Zoom meetings once a month and learn more about yourself and find out truly who are you. Thank you again, Mr. Lanier.
Thank you for having me.
Y'all have a good rest of your day.
Okay.